A secret kept for decades can weigh more than a lifetime. When I discovered I was pregnant that summer of 1962, I never imagined I would never know who my child's father was. Good morning, my dears. I'm Mrs. Elaine, 82 years old, and today I'll share a story I've kept deep in my heart for a long time. Before I begin, please like this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always a joy to know my stories reach so many different places. In 1962, I was a 19-year-old girl full of dreams with my whole life ahead of me. I lived in Millbrook, a small town in rural Pennsylvania, where everyone knew each other and secrets spread faster than rainwater down a hill. My father owned the only fabric store in town, a respected establishment that supplied materials to local seamstresses and women who sewed for their families. Our house was behind the store, a simple but comfortable building with a backyard full of fruit trees that my mother tended with such care. My bedroom windows overlooked this yard, and it was through them that I often escaped on nights when the moon called me to an adventure that would change my life forever. Back then, being a good girl meant following very strict rules. We woke up early, helped with household chores, went to church every Sunday, and in my case, I also worked in my father's store, serving customers and organizing the colorful fabrics that arrived from the city. My hands still remember the feel of each texture, the softness of cotton, the delicacy of silk, the shine of satin we used for party dresses. It was in the store that I met Gregory. He was the son of Mr. Joseph, owner of the town's most traditional bakery. He always came to buy fabrics for his father's employees' uniforms, and over time, these visits became more frequent and less related to business. Gregory was a handsome young man from a good family, hard-working, exactly the type of boy every mother dreamed of for her daughter. "Elaine, that son of Mr. Joseph can't take his eyes off you," my mother would say with a knowing smile. "He's a good catch, comes from a decent family." And so, with my parents' blessing, we began a traditional courtship, as was proper in those days. He visited me on Sunday afternoons. We sat in the living room under my mother's watchful eye, who pretended to sew while monitoring us. We walked in the town square after church, always holding hands, greeting acquaintances. Gregory brought me flowers and sometimes chocolates that he made himself at the bakery. It was a sweet, peaceful romance, approved by everyone, but my restless heart wanted more than that tranquility. It was in June 1962, during the summer festivals, that my life changed forever. The town received a group of traveling musicians who performed at the fairs. Among them was Isaac, a long-haired guitarist with an easy smile, who sang songs about distant places, forbidden loves, and freedom. Just one look during his performance was enough to light something inside me. "Do you always come to watch shows alone like this?" he asked when he saw me observing the band's rehearsal the next day behind the church. "I shouldn't be here," I replied, feeling my face burn, "but your music brought me." Isaac smiled in that way that made my heart race. Music has that power, makes us go where we shouldn't, feel what we shouldn't feel. We began meeting secretly in the old abandoned warehouse behind the movie theater. Isaac came to town every 2 weeks with his band. On those nights, I escaped through my bedroom window, tiptoed across the yard, and ran through the dark streets to our secret meeting place. With Gregory, I was the Elaine everyone knew, modest, obedient, the fabric store owner's daughter. With Isaac, I was someone else, free, passionate, able to dream of horizons beyond that small town. He told me about the big cities he visited, taught me songs, spoke of a world where women could choose their own paths. "Come with me next time I leave," he would say. "We can see the whole country together." I knew it was crazy, but at that age, at 19, you believe love is stronger than everything. And so I lived that double life. By day, Gregory's perfect girlfriend. By night, during the weeks Isaac was in town, the passionate lover of a wandering musician. Of course, it couldn't work out. Life has a strange way of making us pay for our choices. In August of that year, I started feeling morning sickness. My dresses became tighter at the waist, and my period, always so regular, didn't come for 2 consecutive months. At first, I tried to deny the obvious. I prayed every night, asking for it to be just a delay, a reaction of my body to stress, anything but what I feared. But deep down, I knew. I was expecting a child. And worst of all, I didn't know who the father was. I tried to hide the pregnancy as long as I could. I used tight bands around my stomach, looser dresses. I avoided staying too long near my mother, who would certainly notice the changes in my body. I lived in constant fear that someone would discover my secret. In those days, an unmarried pregnant girl was considered a family disgrace. She would be thrown out of her home, rejected by society, often sent away to have the baby in secret, which would then be given up for adoption. Others were forced to hastily marry the child's father, but in my case, how could I explain that I myself didn't know who the father was? I spent weeks in agony, not knowing what to do. I thought about telling Gregory, pretending the child was his, but I couldn't deceive him that way. I thought about running away with Isaac, but he led an unstable life, without roots, without guarantees. And there was always the doubt, what if the child wasn't his? While I struggled with this dilemma, fate decided for me. It was a Sunday. We were all at church, as usual. The heat inside the church was unbearable that morning. The candles, the incense, the bodies pressed together on wooden benches, it all created a suffocating atmosphere. I was wearing a very tight girdle to disguise my growing belly. Perhaps because of that, or the heat, or the weight of guilt I carried, I felt strong dizziness in the middle of the service. I remember seeing my mother's worried face approaching, hearing distant voices asking if I was all right. And then everything went dark. When I awoke, I was in the church vestry. Father Matthew, Dr. Wilson, my parents, and Gregory were all around me, all with grave expressions. The doctor had examined me while I was unconscious and discovered my secret. "Your daughter is approximately 3 months pregnant," I heard Dr. Wilson tell my father in a low voice, but not low enough that I couldn't hear. The silence that followed was the most frightening sound I had ever heard. I saw my father's face transform, going from concern to shock, and then rage. My mother began to cry silently, covering her face with her hands. Gregory was pale and motionless like a statue. When we left the church, I tried to explain, to say something that might ease the situation, but there were no words. My father took me home in absolute silence while people watched us and whispered. In that small town, news flew, and before we even reached home, half of Millbrook must have known that the fabric store owner's daughter was expecting a child without being married. At home came the explosion I had so feared. "You have dishonored our family," my father shouted, hitting the wooden floor with his cane. "How could you do this to us, to Gregory?" "Dad, I can explain," I tried to say, but he didn't want to hear. "Explain what? That you gave yourself before marriage? That you made fools of us?" My mother just cried in a corner of the kitchen, unable to look me in the eyes. Then we heard loud knocks on the door. It was Gregory, accompanied by his parents. They had come to demand explanations. I thought there might be a chance to resolve the situation, that Gregory might understand, that we could quickly get married and raise the child as ours, despite the doubt that gnawed at me. But everything fell apart when Carmela, the town's well-known gossip, appeared at the gate. "I came to see if you need anything, Martha," she said to my mother, but her eyes gleamed with malicious curiosity. And then, as if casually, she turned to Gregory. "Good to see you here, boy. I thought you had traveled with your father. I saw a girl just like Elaine entering the warehouse by the cinema with that musician from the band the night before last." Gregory's face transformed before me. From pale, it turned red with anger. He turned to me, his eyes full of hurt and fury. "So that was it? You were meeting with that vagabond behind my back?" I couldn't deny it. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to stammer some explanation. "And now you're expecting a child. How dare you try to make a fool of me? How do I know this child is mine?" People began to gather in front of our house, attracted by the shouting. My shame was so great that I wished the ground would open up. "You deceived me, made me look like a fool, and now you want to pin another man's child on me." Gregory then took from his pocket the brooch he had given me as a birthday present, a small silver heart that I wore every Sunday, and threw it on the floor. "It's over. I never want to look at your face again." And he marched off, followed by his parents and the curious stares of the neighborhood. That night, my father gave me an ultimatum. I had 1 hour to pack my things and leave the house. "You are no longer my daughter," were his last words to me for many years. My mother, hidden from my father, gave me some money and the address of a distant cousin in New York City. "Go there," she whispered through tears. "When your father calms down, who knows?" But we both knew that door had closed. With just a cardboard suitcase containing some clothes, a photo of my family, and the money my mother had given me in secret, I caught the last bus to New York that same night. As the bus moved away from Millbrook, I looked through the window at the town lights fading behind. I placed my hand on my belly, still almost flat, and whispered, "It's just the two of us now, my child. But I'll do everything so you never know what it's like to be in need or feel shame." And so began my journey as a single mother, not knowing who my child's father was, in an era when that was one of the worst stigmas a woman could bear. Can you imagine the fear I felt? A 19-year-old girl alone in a big city, expecting a child without family, without a husband, without a profession. But you know, my dears, sometimes in the most difficult moments, we discover a strength we didn't know we had. I arrived in New York on a cold August morning in 1962. The bus left me at the old bus station, a noisy and intimidating place for a small-town girl. I clutched my cardboard suitcase tightly against my chest, as if those few belongings were my only connection to the world I had left behind. My mother's cousin, Mrs. Cecilia, lived in a neighborhood far from downtown. I took a taxi, spending part of the little money I had, because I knew nothing about that immense and frightening city. When I finally arrived at the address, dawn was breaking. I remember the gray sky, so different from the clear blue of my town, as if even the colors conspired to make me feel more alone. Mrs. Cecilia was a widowed lady who rented rooms in her large old house. She had no children and lived off these rentals and a small pension left by her husband. When I knocked on her door and introduced myself as the second cousin of Helen, my mother, she looked me up and down. Her eyes lingered for a moment on my belly, still barely visible. "Your mother sent me a telegram yesterday," she said without much emotion. "I already know about your situation. You can stay, but only until the baby is born. Then you'll have to find another place." It was hard to hear those words, but in those days, a girl in my situation couldn't expect much more. I accepted the conditions, grateful to at least have a roof over my head for the next few months. The room was small, at the back of the house, with a window that looked out onto a narrow yard. There was a single bed, an old wardrobe, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. It would be there that I would spend the most transformative months of my life. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, I began my search for work. I needed to gather money quickly, not only to pay for the room rent, but also to prepare for the baby's arrival. The problem was that nobody wanted to employ an unmarried, pregnant girl. I knocked on many doors, heard many no's. I endured judgmental looks and even cruel words. Finally, a bakery in the neighborhood agreed to hire me to work at the counter during the mornings. The owner, Mr. Arnold, was a man of few words but a generous heart. I think he took pity on my situation, or perhaps he desperately needed help. I never knew for sure. The salary was minimal, but it included a bread roll and a glass of milk every day, which was already a blessing for someone who needed to feed not only herself, but also the life growing inside her. The mornings at the bakery were busy, with hurried customers wanting to be served quickly. Despite the fatigue and morning sickness, I strived to smile and be efficient. In the afternoon, I found another job as a housekeeper for a family in the neighboring district. Mrs. Margaret was the wife of a doctor and had 3 small children. She hired me knowing my condition, something rare in those times. "I've been a mother 3 times. I know how difficult it is," she said with a kindness that made me cry. "You can work here as long as you can, and if you need to miss work when the baby is born, I understand." The afternoons at the Avery family's house were exhausting. I cleaned, ironed, helped take care of the children. I returned to Mrs. Cecilia's room at dusk with swollen feet and an aching back, but it still wasn't enough. I needed more money if I wanted to give my child a decent future. That's when my sewing skills, learned from an early age from my mother, became my salvation. I bought threads and needles with the little money I had left and began doing small repairs for the other tenants in Mrs. Cecilia's house. Soon, word spread that there was a good seamstress at the widow's house, and I began receiving orders to hem pants, adjust dresses, mend tiers. I worked late into the night by the light of a weak lamp, my eyes burning, but my hands never stopping. I sewed while dreaming of a better future, where my child would be proud of me, where we wouldn't need to hide or be ashamed. My belly grew, and with it, the difficulties. In the 6th month, the bakery owner gently told me he could no longer keep me at the counter as my condition bothered some customers. He offered me work in the back, preparing dough with reduced pay. I accepted, swallowing my pride and sadness, because I couldn't afford to lose that income. It was during this period that I met Mrs. Zoe, one of the bakery's customers. She had a small beauty salon in the neighborhood and, upon learning of my sewing skills, invited me to help in making caps and aprons for her employees. I accepted immediately, grateful for another source of income. Mrs. Zoe's salon became a safe haven for me. The women who worked and frequented the place were affectionate, without judgments. There, for the first time since I left my town, I felt I could breathe without the weight of stigma on my shoulders. On Saturday afternoons, when I finished early at the Avery's house, I would stop by the salon to deliver the pieces I had sewn and stay a while listening to the lively conversations, the laughter, the harmless gossip. "Girl, you have a gift with the needle," Mrs. Zoe always told me. "When this baby is born and you get settled, you should think about opening your own atelier." Those words planted a seed in me, a dream for the future that helped me keep going on the most difficult days. Time passed, and my belly got so big that even working as a housekeeper became almost impossible. Mrs. Avery, compassionate as always, offered me lighter work, just taking care of the family's clothes, which I could take to wash and iron in my room. March 1963 arrived with suffocating heat. My son was expected to be born in the middle of the month, and I was still struggling to gather enough money for the delivery expenses and the first few months. I had managed to buy some second-hand baby clothes, a small wicker cradle I found at a fair, and gathered some sheets and cloth diapers. In the early hours of March 17th, I felt the first contractions. I was alone in my room with no one to help me. I endured the growing pains for hours until at dawn I desperately knocked on Mrs. Cecilia's door. "The baby is coming," I said between groans of pain. She called a taxi and took me to the nearest public hospital. The journey was torture. Each jolt of the car seemed to split my body in half. At the hospital, I was left on a gurney in the hallway, as all the delivery rooms were occupied. The nurses passed by hurriedly, casting only quick glances in my direction. One of them, younger, stopped for a moment. "Is it your first child?" she asked in a voice that tried to be gentle. "Yes," I replied through tears of pain and fear. "And the father isn't coming?" I couldn't answer. How could I explain to that stranger that I didn't even know who my child's father was? I just looked away, swallowing my tears. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I was taken to a collective delivery room. There was no anesthesia available for simple cases like mine. I remember the white ceiling, the bright lights, the impersonal voices of doctors giving orders, and the pain. A pain that seemed to tear my body and soul. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard the cry, a strong cry, determined, as if announcing to the world, "I'm here, and I'm here to stay." "It's a boy," said the doctor without much emotion, handing the small bloody bundle to a nurse. When they finally placed my son in my arms, hours later, something indescribable happened inside me. I looked at that little red face, the half-closed eyes, the small mouth instinctively seeking food, and knew with a certainty I had never felt before that every sacrifice would be worth it for him. "John," I whispered, touching his tiny hand. "Your name will be John, like my grandfather, the most honorable man I ever knew." I spent only 2 days in the hospital. It was the standard time given to mothers without complications in childbirth, especially those who, like me, had no health insurance or money for a private room. I returned to Mrs. Cecilia's room with my little John in my arms, my body still in pain, my heart divided between the immense love for that creature and the fear of the uncertain future that awaited us. The first weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, painful breastfeeding, diapers to wash, and a fatigue that penetrated to the bones. John was a healthy baby but fussy, especially at night. Mrs. Cecilia would knock on the wall when the crying went on too long, complaining about the noise. The other tenants looked at me with deep circles under their eyes, resentful of having their sleep disturbed. Gradually, I created a routine. During the day, while John slept, I sewed nonstop, accepting any work that came my way. At night, when he woke up hungry or uncomfortable, I sang softly the lullabies my mother sang to me, rocking him in my arms until he fell back asleep. Mrs. Avery, my employer at the house where I worked as a housekeeper, was a blessing during this period. She allowed me to bring John with me when I went to pick up the clothes to wash, and often gave me clothes and toys her children no longer used. Her 3 boys adored Miss Elaine's baby and would gather around the basket where I put him, making faces to get smiles from him. One afternoon, when John was about 2 months old, Mrs. Avery made me an unexpected proposal. "Elaine, we're renovating the back of the house to make a guest room, but I thought perhaps you and the little one could occupy it. It would be good to have someone trustworthy living here, especially when we travel to visit my parents in the country. In exchange, you could take care of the house and the children occasionally." The offer fell like a blessing from heaven. The deadline Mrs. Cecilia had given me to find another place was almost up, and the idea of looking for a room with a small baby terrified me. Besides, the room at the back of the Averys' house would be much better than the cramped cubicle where we were living. And so, when John turned 3 months old, we moved into the small room at the back of the Avery family's house. It was simple but clean and airy, with enough space for John's cradle and my few possessions. Most importantly, it was a place where we could stay without the constant weight of disapproval, a place we could call home. It was there, in that simple room, that I began to rebuild my life. Gradually, my sewing clientele grew. Mrs. Avery's friends, impressed with the dresses I made for her, began to order pieces from me. Money was still tight, but enough to keep us with dignity. John grew strong and healthy. At 6 months, he was already sitting up by himself and smiling at everyone, winning hearts with his bright eyes and chubby cheeks. When he turned 1 year old, I gave a small party in the backyard of the house. Mrs. Avery and the children sang happy birthday. Mrs. Zoe brought a cake from the salon, and even Mrs. Cecilia showed up bringing a small wooden car that had belonged to her late husband when he was a child. Looking at all those people gathered around my son, people who had entered our lives by chance and become our chosen family, I felt immense gratitude. It hadn't been easy, and many nights I still cried alone, missing my parents, my town, the life I could have had. But when I looked at John's smiling face, I knew I would do it all over again, exactly the same way, just to have him in my arms. That night, after everyone had left and John was sleeping peacefully in his crib, I wrote a letter to my mother, the first since I had left Millbrook. I told her about the birth of her grandson, about how we were getting by, and included a small photo of John that Mrs. Avery had taken with her camera. I didn't know if my mother would receive the letter, if my father would allow it, or even if they still lived at the same address. But I had to try. I needed to leave a door open to the past, even as I built our future. Let's resume our story from where we left off. Did my mother respond to the letter I sent when John turned 1 year old? Yes, she did. 3 weeks after sending it, I received a thin envelope with my mother's trembling handwriting on the address. Inside was just a small note and some money. My daughter, your father doesn't know about this letter. Your son is beautiful. I keep you both in my prayers. Use this money for whatever you need. With love, your mother. It was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. Knowing that my mother still thought of me, that she hadn't completely disowned me, brought a hope I hadn't felt in a long time. That money, which wasn't much but represented her sacrifice to get it hidden from my father, I saved for John's education. It was the beginning of a savings account that I maintained religiously, even in the most difficult months. The years passed, and John grew strong, intelligent, and curious. At 2, he was already speaking clearly, asking questions about everything around him. At 3, he learned to recognize letters and numbers, observing the books of Mrs. Avery's children. He was a happy child, despite all the difficulties, as if he had inherited an inner strength that I didn't even know I possessed. In 1967, when John turned 4, our lives took a new direction. Mrs. Avery, who had become not just my employer but a true friend, called me for a conversation. Elaine, you know we greatly admire your work with sewing. My husband has an aunt who is opening a small children's clothing factory and needs someone with your talent. It would be a steady job with all the benefits. What do you think? The opportunity seemed heaven-sent. A stable job with benefits was more than I dared to dream. I accepted immediately, despite the fear of changing again, of leaving the safe little world I had built at the back of the Avery's house. Mrs. Grace's factory, Dr. Avery's aunt, was in the garment district, known for its clothing trade. It was a not very large warehouse, with several sewing machines lined up, cutting tables, and mountains of colorful fabrics. When I entered that space for the first time, feeling the smell of new fabric and hearing the rhythmic sound of the machines, I knew I was in the right place. I was hired as the main seamstress, responsible for the most delicate pieces and the final touches. The salary was better than anything I had earned until then, and the hours allowed me to leave John at the newly opened public school in the morning and pick him up in the afternoon. In the first months, we continued living at the back of the Avery's house, but with the stability of the new job, I began looking for a place of our own. It was difficult to find someone who would rent to a single woman with a child, but I finally managed to get a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building not far from the factory. It was tiny, just 1 bedroom, a living room that also served as a kitchen and a bathroom, but it was ours. I painted the walls light yellow, made flowery curtains for the windows, bought a new bed for me and another for John on installments. When we moved in January 1968, John ran from one side of the apartment to the other, amazed. "Mom, is it all ours? Just ours?" "Yes, my love, it's our little home." He opened such a radiant smile that I felt my heart expand. At that moment, all the tears shed, all the hard work, all the loneliness were worth it. Life gained a pleasant routine. In the morning, I took John to school before going to work. In the afternoon, he waited for me at the house of an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Isabel, who cared for some children from the building in exchange for a small amount. At night, we had dinner together, and then I helped him with his lessons, or we read stories, or simply talked about our day. John was an observant and sensitive child. From early on, he noticed that our family was different from others. When he was 5, he came home from school one day with a furrowed brow. "Mom, why don't I have a dad like the other boys?" The question I had so feared had finally arrived. I sat with him on our small sofa, thinking carefully about how to answer. "You have a father, my love. We all do. But some families are different. In some, the father and mother live together. In others, like ours, it's just the mother and child." "But where is my father? Why doesn't he live with us?" How do you explain to a child something that even I didn't fully understand? I opted for a simplified version of the truth. Your father lived in another town, And we separated before you were born. He doesn't know about you. Can we find him? Tell him about me?" John's hopeful look broke my heart. How could I tell him that I didn't know who his father was? That it could be one of two men, neither of whom would probably accept him? "I don't know where he is now, dear, but one day when you're older, we'll talk more about this. The important thing is that we have each other, right?" He nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer for the time being. And the subject was temporarily forgotten, but I knew it would return, that the questions would become more complex as he grew. At the factory, my work was increasingly recognized. Mrs. Grace, an energetic lady in her 60s, had noticed my talent for creating new models, not just copying existing ones. In 1970, she promoted me to head of the creative department with a significant salary increase. "You have good eyes for fashion, girl," she would say with her heavy Boston accent. "You know what mothers will want to dress their children in before they even know it themselves." With a new position came new responsibilities, but also more creative freedom. I began designing entire collections, inspired by the clothes I saw in magazines and in expensive store windows, but adapted to the budget of ordinary families. My ideas were fresh, different, and sales grew rapidly. John, then 7 years old, often accompanied me to the factory on Saturdays. He would sit quietly in a corner, drawing or reading, while I finished some work. The other seamstresses adored him, bringing colorful fabric scraps for his drawings or sweets hidden in the pockets of their aprons. It was on one of those Saturdays that he surprised me with an unexpected question. "Mom, when are you going to have your own store?" I looked at him, astonished. "What do you mean, son?" "Mrs. Grace said you're the best seamstress she's ever met, that you should have your own business. Why don't we have a store just for us?" The idea had crossed my mind a few times, especially when I saw how much the clothes I designed were sold for, a much higher price than I received to create them. But it always seemed like a distant dream, impossible for a woman alone, without capital, without formal training. "It's not that simple, my dear. It takes a lot of money to open a store." "Can we save up?" he said with the unshakable optimism of childhood. "I can help. I can do chores for the neighbors after school." His enthusiasm touched me deeply. That night, after he went to sleep, I sat at our small kitchen table and began to do calculations. How much would be needed to start a small business? How much had I already saved? How long would it take to gather the rest? The numbers were discouraging, but a seed had been planted. I began to save more determinedly, cutting expenses where I could, accepting extra sewing work on weekends. I opened a specific savings account for the store fund, as John called it. The years passed. John grew quickly, was always among the best students in his class, and at 10 was already taller than many 12-year-old boys. When I looked at him, I sometimes saw traits that reminded me of Gregory, the shape of his chin, the way he furrowed his brow when concentrating. Other times, a smile, a gesture brought Isaac to mind. It was a bittersweet memory that made me think about what could have been, the choices I had made. In 1974, an unexpected event changed the course of our lives again. Mrs. Grace, now over 70, decided to retire and sell the factory. She called me to her office one afternoon after everyone had left. "Elaine, you know I have no children. This factory is like a daughter to me, and you, in recent years, have been its soul." She paused, adjusting her glasses on her thin nose. "I have a proposal for you. I can't give you the factory. I need the money from the sale for my old age, but I can sell it to you at a fair price, with payment terms you can afford." I was speechless, my heart beating rapidly. It was an opportunity I had never imagined, much bigger than the small atelier I dreamed of opening one day. "You don't need to answer now," she continued. "Talk to your son, think carefully, but know that I prefer to sell to you, who loves this place as I do, than to a stranger who might destroy everything we've built." That night, I could barely sleep. The proposal was tempting but frightening. Taking over an entire factory with employees, suppliers, customers was a huge risk. What if I failed? What if I lost not only the money invested, but also the security I had built for John? When I told him, however, his eyes shone with excitement. "Mom, it's our dream. It's much better than a small shop. You'll be the owner of an entire factory." His enthusiasm was contagious, but there was still the matter of money. The savings I had been making for the store fund weren't enough for the initial payment Mrs. Grace was asking for. I would need a bank loan, something that seemed almost impossible for a single woman in those days. It was Mrs. Avery, my former employer and constant friend, who showed me a way. Her husband, Dr. Avery, had connections at the bank and offered to be my guarantor. With his help, I got the loan needed for the initial payment. In January 1975, I signed the papers that made me the owner of the factory. I changed the name to Elaine Creations, investing in a new illuminated sign on the facade. The responsibility was immense, the sleepless nights frequent, but there was also a sense of accomplishment that I had never experienced before. The first months were turbulent. I had to quickly learn about aspects of the business I was unfamiliar with: accounting, inventory, negotiating with suppliers, marketing. I made mistakes, of course, some costly, but I also had important successes. I expanded the product line to include baby clothes that had a higher profit margin. I hired a young, newly graduated designer to bring fresh ideas. I invested in advertisements in the most popular women's magazines. John, now 12 years old, spent more and more time at the factory after school. He had a natural talent for numbers and soon became my unofficial assistant, helping with accounting books and inventory control. His constant presence at the factory raised eyebrows, a boy in a predominantly female environment, but he didn't seem to mind. "I like to be where you are, Mom," he would tell me when I asked if he wouldn't prefer to be playing ball with friends. As the factory grew, our personal life also improved. In 1976, we bought our first car, a used light blue Volkswagen Beetle. John, who had just turned 13, declared he would learn to drive as soon as he was old enough. At the end of that same year, we managed to fulfill another dream, moving to a larger apartment with 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a kitchen where we could finally have a decent table for meals. It was on the 5th floor of a building with an elevator, a luxury that delighted us. From the living room window, we could see a piece of Central Park, a view that never ceased to amaze me, even after years living there. John's adolescence brought new challenges. He was an introspective young man, more interested in books and numbers than in sports or parties. At school, he excelled in math and science, but had few close friends. Sometimes I worried if the absence of a father figure had affected his development, if my efforts to be both mother and father had been enough. But he seemed happy, in his quiet and reflective way. His teachers praised him, saying he had potential for a brilliant career. When he turned 15 in 1978, he already knew he wanted to study accounting at university. "I'll take care of the factory's finances," he would say, with a determination that reminded me of myself when young. "We'll expand, open stores in other neighborhoods, maybe even in other cities." His enthusiasm for the business I had built filled me with pride. It wasn't the path I had imagined for him. Secretly, I dreamed of seeing him become a doctor or lawyer, but it was a choice I respected, and that made sense for our small world. As John approached adulthood, the questions about his father, temporarily forgotten during childhood, began to resurface with more force. At 16, during an ordinary dinner in our apartment, he approached the subject directly. "Mom, I think I'm old enough now to know more about my father. Who was he? Why did he never try to find us?" The question, though expected, still caught me off guard. I looked at the young man before me, for that's what he was becoming, a man. And I knew he deserved more than the half-truths I had offered over the years. "It's a complicated story, son," I began, feeling my heart race. "And it's not something I'm proud to tell, but you're right. You're old enough to know. Should I tell him the whole truth about the 2 men, about my indecision, about the fact that I really didn't know who his biological father was?" How would he react to that? Would it be too heavy a burden to place on his young shoulders? As I struggled with these questions, looking at my son's expectant face, the phone rang, interrupting our moment. It was from the factory, an emergency with a large order that needed to be delivered the next day. The conversation would have to wait. And it did. For another year, I found excuses to postpone that difficult conversation. There was always something more urgent, more immediate. A problem at the factory, John's school exams, the sudden illness of Mrs. Isabel, our former neighbor. But fate, as always, had its own plans. In 1980, when John was about to turn 18 and was preparing for college entrance exams, I received an unexpected letter from Millbrook. It was from my mother, the first in several years, informing me that my father had passed away after a stroke. "He never allowed me to mention your name or the boys," she wrote. "But in his last days, he asked forgiveness for many things. I think he thought of you. If you can, come to the funeral. It would be good to see you again after so long." The news hit me in a strange way. I didn't cry immediately. There was a numbness, an emotional distance created by almost 2 decades of separation. But there was also a grief for what could have been, for reconciliations that never happened. I showed the letter to John, who read it in silence. "Are we going?" he simply asked. I realized then that this would be more than a trip to a funeral. It would be a return to the roots, a confrontation with the past I had left behind, and perhaps, finally, the opportunity for the conversation we had been postponing. The letter about my father's death arrived on a Saturday morning in July 1980. John and I decided to travel to Millbrook the following day. I closed the factory for 3 days, the first time I had done so since taking over the business, and we set off on an interstate bus, carrying only a small suitcase with clothes for the funeral and a few days' stay. The journey was silent. Each of us, lost in our own thoughts, observed through the window the landscape that gradually changed, the buildings and asphalt of the city giving way to green fields, plantations, small country towns. John, beside me, read a book, but I noticed his eyes stayed for long periods on the same page, his mind clearly elsewhere. "What was my grandfather like?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I took a deep breath, seeking fair words to describe a complex man who had been both rigid and authoritarian, as well as hard-working and honorable. "Your grandfather Anthony was a man of firm principles. He grew up in a different time, with different values. He was hard, sometimes too severe, but he believed he was doing the best for the family. He was respected in town. He worked from dawn to dusk in that fabric store. His hands were calloused from carrying heavy bales, but I never heard him complain about work." I paused, remembering my father's face on Sunday mornings when he shaved before church. He loved music, you know. He didn't play any instrument, but he knew all the lyrics to the old songs. On Sundays after lunch, he would put records on the phonograph and sing to my mother, making her laugh with his awkward dancing. These memories, long forgotten, emerged unexpectedly, bringing a lump to my throat. It was strange how I could miss someone who had caused me so much pain. "Why did he never want to know us?" John asked with that direct frankness that always characterized him. "It was his pride, son. When I left, under the circumstances I did, it was a stain on the family's honor, something unforgivable to him. It wasn't about you, understand? It never was. It was about me, about what he saw as my transgression." John nodded, absorbing this information with the serious expression he assumed when trying to solve a particularly difficult problem. At 18, he was already taller than me, with broad shoulders that made me think about how quickly time had passed. He was no longer the little boy who held my hand to cross the street, but a young man about to begin his adult life. We arrived in Millbrook in the late afternoon. The town had grown in the 18 years since my departure, but it still maintained that small-town air, with its central square, the imposing church, the old houses with colored windows. We took a taxi from the bus station to my parents' house, my mother's house now, at the same address I had left so long ago. When the taxi stopped in front of the familiar gate, I felt my heart quicken. The house seemed smaller than in my memories, the blue paint on the windows a bit peeled, the front garden less exuberant. But it was still the house where I was born and raised, the place I once called home. John got out of the taxi first, taking our suitcase, while I remained paralyzed for a moment, unable to take the next step. It was his encouraging look that gave me the strength to finally leave the car and walk to the gate. Before we even rang the bell, the front door opened. My mother appeared, looking much older and frailer than I remembered. Her hair, once black like mine, was completely white, tied in a simple bun. Her face, marked by deep wrinkles, lit up when she saw me. "Elaine," she said in a trembling voice, "you came?" We embraced right there in the small front garden. 18 years of separation dissolving in an instant. She cried silently, and I realized there were also tears streaming down my face. When we finally separated, her gaze turned to John, who remained a few steps behind, respecting our moment. She stared at him for a long time, her eyes scanning every detail of the grandson she had never met in person. "You have your grandfather's eyes," she finally said, "the same eyes as my Anthony when he was young." John smiled timidly, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you, Grandma." She ignored the outstretched hand and pulled him into a tight hug, as if trying to recover all the lost years at once. We entered the house, which inside remained practically identical to my memories. The same dark, heavy furniture, the same pictures on the walls, the familiar smell of freshly made coffee and dried flowers. In the living room, a simple coffin rested on trestles, surrounded by candles and flowers. My father's body, dressed in his best suit, looked serene, as if he were just sleeping. I approached slowly, feeling a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, regret, love, all mixed in a confusing way. I placed my hand on his, cold and rigid, and whispered a silent prayer, asking forgiveness and offering forgiveness at the same time. That night, the house filled with neighbors and friends who came to pay their last respects. Many recognized me, despite the years past, and there were whispers, curious looks directed at me and John. Some approached, offering kind words of condolence. Others kept their distance, as if my presence there was an intrusion. An elderly lady, whom I didn't immediately recognize, held my hands between hers and said, "Your father spoke of you, you know? In the last months when the illness started to worsen, he would ask if anyone had news of you, if you were well." These words hit me deeply. The idea that my father, despite everything, still thought of me, still cared, brought a strange sense of comfort amid the pain. The funeral took place the next morning, in the same church where I had fainted years ago, revealing my pregnancy. It was packed. My father had been a respected figure in the community, and it seemed that the entire town had come to say goodbye. John and I sat beside my mother in the first row, receiving curious looks and a few nods of solidarity. After the burial, we returned to the house, where some women from the neighborhood had prepared food for those who wanted to accompany the family. It was during this time, while serving coffee to some guests, that I saw a face that made my heart stop for an instant. Gregory, older, with pronounced thinning in his now graying hair, but unmistakably him, was standing beside a gentle-looking woman and 2 teenagers who were presumably his children. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw recognition in his, followed by something I couldn't identify. Surprise, perhaps, or unease. I quickly looked away, feeling my face burn. I wasn't prepared for this encounter. Not like this, not now. I took refuge in the kitchen, trying to control my rapid breathing. My mother found me there, leaning on the sink, my knuckles white from the force with which I gripped the edge. "He owns the bakery now," she said softly. "He married Margaret, the pharmacist's daughter, soon after you left. A good man, built a decent life." I nodded, unable to find words. The mere mention of Gregory opened a box of memories that I had kept closed for so long. "And Isaac?" I heard myself asking before I could contain myself. My mother sighed. "That musician continued on the road for a few years. Then I heard he settled in Harrisburg with a fixed band at a restaurant. I don't know anything beyond that." 2 lives that had followed their course, just like mine. 2 men who could be my son's father, both building their own stories, perhaps never thinking about what they had left behind. That night, when the house finally emptied and John had already retired to the room that had belonged to my older brother, now living in California, he couldn't return for the funeral. I sat with my mother on the back porch. The same wooden swing was still there, creaking softly as we swung in the darkness, perfumed by jasmine. "Your son is an admirable young man," she said, breaking the silence. "Educated, intelligent. You did a good job, Elaine." "It wasn't easy," I replied, feeling tears forming. "There were days when I thought I couldn't make it, that it was too much weight to carry alone. But you did it. You've always been strong, stronger than me, who never had the courage to defy your father, even when I disagreed with him." She paused, looking at the stars that dotted the dark sky. "He asked me about you, John, this afternoon, while you were talking to the pastor. He wanted to know what you were like when you were young, if you always wanted to be a seamstress, if—" She hesitated. "If what, Mom?" "If you had loved his father." The question hung between us like something alive, pulsating. I felt a tightness in my chest, thinking about what John might be feeling, the questions that certainly tormented him. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that you were a dreamy girl, talented with needle and thread since you were little. And that, regarding his father, well, I said it was a story that only you could tell." That night, lying in my old bed, in the room that remained practically untouched since my departure, I made a decision. It was time for John to know the whole truth, however difficult it might be. He deserved that, and I needed to free myself from this secret I had carried for so long. The next morning, after breakfast, I invited him for a walk. I took him to the central square where I used to stroll with Gregory on Sundays after church. We sat on a bench under a leafy tree, observing the fountain that sprayed crystal clear water under the morning sun. "You've asked me about your father many times over the years," I began, feeling the words stuck in my throat. "And I've never been completely honest with you." He looked at me with those serious and patient eyes, waiting for me to continue. "The truth is that I don't know who your biological father is. It could be one of 2 men." And then I told him everything about Gregory, the baker's son, the boyfriend approved by the family, whom I planned to marry one day. About Isaac, the itinerant musician who made me dream of a different, free, and exciting life. About how I was divided between the 2, living a lie that eventually collapsed when I discovered the pregnancy. John listened in silence, his face an impenetrable mask. When I finished, long moments passed without him saying anything. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "You saw Gregory yesterday?" he finally said. Not a question, but a statement. I nodded. "Yes, at the wake. He owns the bakery now, has a family. Do you think he could be my father?" "It's possible, just as Isaac is." More silence. John looked at his hands, the long, strong fingers so similar to mine. "Do you want to meet them?" I asked softly. "We could look for Gregory today and maybe find out where Isaac is now." He raised his eyes, meeting mine. There was a determination in them that surprised me. "No," he said firmly. "I don't need to know which of them is my biological father. You've been mother and father to me throughout my life. It's enough." I felt tears streaming down my face, unable to contain them. "Are you sure? I always thought you would like to know, to have that connection. The only connection that matters is the one I have with you, Mom. These men, they weren't there when I was sick with fever at 5 years old, and you spent the whole night by my bedside. They weren't there when I learned to read, when I entered school, when I got my first A in math. They didn't work double to give me a roof, food, education." He held my hands between his, now larger and stronger than mine. "You always told me that family isn't just a matter of blood, but of love, of presence, of daily choices. You chose to be my family every day for 18 years. It's all I need to know." At that moment, Sitting in a square in the town that had rejected me so many years ago with my son, the same son who had been the cause of shame and scandal, I felt a peace I had never experienced before. The pieces of my life, for so long fragmented, finally seemed to fit into a complete picture. We stayed in Millbrook for 3 more days. I helped my mother organize my father's pending affairs, including the sale of the fabric store, which was already practically closed when he passed away. I walked with John around the town, showing him the places of my childhood and youth, telling stories of a time that seemed to belong to another life. On the morning of our departure, my mother surprised us with an announcement. "I've been thinking," she said, as we had coffee in the sunny kitchen. "There's nothing holding me here anymore. The house will be sold. The store no longer exists. I would like to go with you to New York, if you'll have me." The idea of having my mother back in my life, of John being able to get to know his grandmother better, of building a new chapter together, filled me with joy. We embraced, crying and laughing at the same time, making plans for the future. We returned to New York 3 days later. The 3 of us together, leaving behind a town full of painful memories, but also taking with us a new sense of completeness, of circles closing and wounds that finally began to heal. My mother adapted quickly to life in the city. We set up a small room for her in our apartment, and soon she became an essential part of our daily life. Her presence brought a new dimension to our family, filling spaces we didn't even know were empty. At the end of that year, John was accepted to study accounting at NYU, one of the most prestigious universities in the country. The celebration in our apartment with cake and champagne marked not only his academic achievement, but also a new chapter for all of us. As I watched my son blow out the candles on a cake that read, "Congratulations, college boy," I thought about everything we had been through, the difficulties overcome, the fears faced, the joys shared. The path hadn't been easy or direct, but each step, each choice, each sacrifice had brought us there, to a moment of pure and deserved happiness. That night, as my mother and John talked animatedly about plans for the future, I found myself thinking about Gregory and Isaac, the paths not taken, the lives that could have been. There was no regret, just a serene acceptance of the past and gratitude for the present. One of those men had contributed DNA to create the extraordinary being that was my son, but it was I who had shaped him, who had educated him, who had loved him unconditionally every day of his life. And that, I finally discovered, was what really mattered. The years that followed our return from Millbrook brought a new phase for our family. John dedicated himself heart and soul to his accounting degree, immersing himself in studies with the same determination that had always characterized him. I remember the nights when I would find him bent over immense accounting books at the kitchen table, his eyes red with fatigue but shining with that insatiable curiosity. My mother's presence transformed our family dynamic. At 67, Helen, whom everyone always called Mrs. Nora, brought to our apartment not only her experience and wisdom, but also a renewed energy. Contrary to the stereotype of the elderly lady who just rests and watches life go by, she insisted on becoming an active part of our daily routine. "I'm old, not dead," she would say when I tried to prevent her from helping with household chores or at the factory. Soon, she found her place at Elaine Creations. With her skillful hands, she taught the younger seamstresses ancient techniques that were being lost. Her attentive eye for details and finishes further elevated the quality of our pieces. Customers loved talking to her, and her suggestions for the children's line, inspired by the clothes she used to make for me and my siblings, became some of our best-selling products. In 1982, when John was in the middle of his university course, we made an important decision: to expand the business. With the country's economy in crisis, many entrepreneurs would hesitate to take this step, but I saw an opportunity where others saw only risks. The large clothing factories were reducing production, leaving a space in the market that we could occupy with our quality pieces and more accessible prices. We rented a larger warehouse in the garment district, invested in more modern machines, and hired more seamstresses. John, even though still a student, took over the financial and administrative part, applying in practice what he learned in classes. His ability with numbers and planning, allied with my experience and creativity, formed a perfect partnership. The expansion brought challenges, of course. There were sleepless nights worried about payrolls, delivery deadlines, negotiations with suppliers, but it also brought enormous satisfaction to see our small family business growing, generating jobs, being recognized for quality and ethics in the treatment of employees and customers. In 1984, John graduated with honors, being the class speaker. Sitting in the audience between my mother and Mrs. Avery, who remained a constant presence in our lives, I felt such great pride that I thought my chest would explode. That elegant young man on the stage, speaking confidently about social responsibility and professional ethics, was the same baby I had cradled alone on nights of fear and uncertainty. Each of us, he said in his speech, carries the legacy of those who came before. But we also have the responsibility to build our own path, to transform what we receive into something even better to pass on. His words seemed especially directed at me, a silent acknowledgement of the journey we had shared. The graduation marked not only the end of an academic stage, but also the beginning of a new phase in the business. With John officially as a partner and financial director, Elaine Creations took its next big step, opening our first retail store. Until then, we had sold wholesale to other stores or directly from the factory to customers who knew our work. Having a retail space was an old dream that we finally realized in March 1985 on a busy street in Midtown. I remember the emotion of seeing the facade with our name, the elegant windows displaying our creations, customers entering curiously to know the pieces they had already heard about. It was in that store, on a rainy afternoon in August, that the past crossed our path again in an unexpected way. I was serving a customer, showing her our new collection of children's dresses, when I heard the doorbell. I looked up and saw a woman approximately my age, elegant in a navy blue dress, accompanied by a young woman who seemed to be her daughter. Something about her seemed familiar, but I couldn't immediately identify it. When I finished with my customer, I approached to serve them. The woman looked at me and smiled, a smile that awakened a distant memory. "Elaine? You're Elaine, aren't you?" I nodded, trying to place that face in my memories. "I'm Margaret, Gregory's wife. We saw each other briefly at your father's funeral a few years ago." I felt a chill down my spine. Margaret, Gregory's wife, the woman who had built a life with the man who could be the father of my son. "Of course, Margaret. How are you?" "Well, thank you. This is my daughter, Catherine. We're looking for a dress for her wedding." Catherine smiled timidly, extending her hand. She was a pretty girl, with eyes that reminded me very much of Gregory. "Your store was highly recommended by a friend," Margaret continued. "She said nobody makes dresses as elegant and well-finished as Elaine Creations." What followed was a surreal encounter. I served them, as I would with any customer, showing options, discussing fabrics and models, taking measurements, but my mind was elsewhere, imagining the strange paths that life traces. There I was, creating the wedding dress for Gregory's daughter, while my own son, who could be her half-brother, worked in the back room, completely unaware of this connection. When Margaret mentioned that the wedding would be in Millbrook, in the same church I had attended in my youth, I asked, trying to sound casual, "Does your husband still have the bakery there?" "Yes, St. Joseph's Bakery is an institution in the town now. Gregory expanded the business, opened a cafe next door. Our oldest son works with him, will take over when his father retires." I felt a pang of something, not exactly envy, perhaps melancholy, thinking about the life Gregory had built, the continuity of his legacy through his son. But soon the feeling passed, replaced by the certainty that my own path, however difficult it had been, had brought me exactly where I should be. When John appeared from the back room to ask me about an order, I introduced him simply as my son and partner. Margaret was politely cordial, without showing any suspicion about the possible connection. I carefully observed John's and Catherine's faces side by side, looking for similarities, but I couldn't discern anything conclusive. Perhaps it was better that way. In the following weeks, as I worked on Catherine's wedding dress, I reflected a lot on the quirks of fate. How two lives that had been so intertwined, mine and Gregory's, followed such different paths, only to cross again so many years later in such an unexpected way. When the dress was ready, Margaret came to pick it up alone. As we carefully wrapped the piece, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Gregory knows the dress was made here," she said suddenly. "When I mentioned your name, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about you two, about what happened." I felt my heart quicken, not knowing what to say. "He wonders sometimes," she continued in a soft voice, "about you, about how it might have been. Not out of regret, we're happy together, but out of curiosity about the paths not taken." Her words echoed my own thoughts, and for a moment we shared a silent understanding, woman to woman. "Tell him I'm well," I finally replied, "that I've built a good life, that I'm happy." She nodded, taking the package with the dress. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "Your son, he looks a lot like you." I never knew if there was something more in that observation, some insinuation or unformulated question. I preferred to believe it was just a kind comment, a way to end our brief reunion with courtesy. The dress I created for Catherine became an important milestone for Elaine Creations. Photos of the wedding were published in a local newspaper, and soon we began receiving orders for wedding dresses from all over the state. Almost without realizing it, we transitioned from children's and casual fashion to a line of party and wedding dresses that quickly became our specialty. In 1987, the year John turned 24, two events transformed our lives again. The first was the arrival of Mary, a newly graduated young designer whom we hired to help with the growing demand for wedding dresses. Intelligent, creative, and determined, she brought a new energy to the atelier and, without anyone planning it, captured my son's heart. I observed the romance develop first with concern. Mary was an employee, after all. Then with joy, seeing the happiness she brought to John. They shared not only love, but also compatible values, dreams, and ambitions. She understood him in a way few could, respecting his more serious and methodical nature, while encouraging him to explore his more creative and spontaneous side. The second event was less happy. My mother was diagnosed with a heart condition that, although not immediately fatal, would significantly reduce her life expectancy. The news hit us like a blow, especially because we had had so little time together after so many years of separation. "I don't want sadness," she said, with that quiet determination that always characterized her. "I've had a long life, met my grandson, reconciled with my daughter. What more could I ask for?" Her attitude toward the disease was a lesson in dignity and acceptance. She continued working at the factory as long as her strength allowed, insisting that the activity kept her alive. On afternoons when she felt more tired, she would sit by the apartment window, observing the movement of the city while doing small embroidery work, creating delicate details that became a special signature of our dresses. At the end of that year, John surprised me with the announcement that he had proposed to Mary. "The ceremony will be simple," he said, "just for family and close friends." What he didn't know was that Mary and I were already secretly working on her dress. A special creation that combined traditional elements with modern touches, reflecting her unique personality. The preparation for the wedding brought renewed excitement to our house, especially for my mother, who insisted on participating in all the details, from choosing the flowers to the menu for the small reception we would have in our apartment. "I'm going to live to see my great-grandchild," she declared, with a conviction that admitted no contradiction. "So, don't take too long after the wedding." John and Mary married on a sunny afternoon in May 1988 in a small chapel in the Upper East Side. As I watched my son receiving his bride at the altar, dressed in the creation we had made together, I thought about how life comes full circle. The single girl, who had been thrown out of her house for being pregnant, was now a respected businesswoman, seeing her son, the very same one she had carried amid so much prejudice and difficulty, build his own family. The reception in our apartment was lively and welcoming. Mrs. Avery and Dr. Avery were there, of course, having become practically part of the family over the years. Mrs. Zoe, quite elderly now but still spirited as always, brought her girls from the salon, who had been my first sewing clients. John's college colleagues, factory employees, neighbors who had become friends. It was an eclectic group, united by genuine affection for the newlyweds. At one point during the party, I found John alone on the balcony, observing the sky that was beginning to be dotted with stars. "Happy?" I asked, stopping beside him. "More than I could express," he replied with a serene smile. "You know, Mom, I've been thinking about paths and choices. What kind of choices? Yours, mine. How one decision can completely change the course of a life. If you had chosen differently back then in Millbrook, I might not even exist, or I would be a completely different person." He paused, looking inside the apartment where Mary was chatting animatedly with my mother. "Sometimes I wonder about him, my biological father, whoever he is. If he regrets not having known me, if he thinks about how it would have been. But then I realize it doesn't really matter. The family we've built, the path we've walked together, that's what defines who we are." His words echoed my own thoughts, the conclusion I had reached after years of reflection. I hugged my son, feeling a love so great it barely fit in my chest. "You gave me purpose, John. You taught me to be strong when I thought I couldn't go on. Everything I am today, I owe to you. And I owe everything to you, Mom. Absolutely everything." The months following the wedding brought important changes. John and Mary bought their own apartment, not far from ours. Elaine Creations continued to grow with the opening of a second store, this time specializing exclusively in wedding and party dresses. My mother, although with increasingly fragile health, remained active and involved in everything, especially when, in early 1989, Mary announced she was pregnant. The news brought indescribable joy, particularly for my mother, who seemed to gain new strength with the prospect of meeting her great-grandchild. Sarah was born in September of that year, a healthy and beautiful girl who from the first moment became the center of our universe. Seeing John hold his daughter for the first time, with that mixture of reverence and fear that only first-time parents know, was one of the most exciting moments of my life. "Now I understand how you felt," he said, looking in wonder at the small bundle in his arms. "This love is overwhelming." The months that followed were a whirlwind of diapers, bottles, sleepless nights, and indescribable joys. I became a doting grandmother, spending every free moment with my granddaughter, sewing tiny dresses and decorations for her room, singing the same lullabies I had sung to her father. My mother, as she had promised, lived to meet and love her great-granddaughter. The moments when the two were together, the woman at the end of life and the girl at the beginning, had something magical about them, as if an invisible circle was completed. Unfortunately, when Sarah was only 5 months old, my mother left us. It was a peaceful departure during sleep, as she had always wished. The pain of loss was deep, but eased by the certainty that she had departed in peace, reconciled with her past, surrounded by the love of the family she valued so much. At her funeral, very different from my father's years before, there were only people who genuinely loved her. No appearances or social conventions, just the sincere celebration of a life that, despite the setbacks, had been full of meaning. In the years that followed, our family continued to grow and evolve. John and Mary had another child, Lucas, 3 years after Sarah. Elaine Creations established itself as a reference in bridal fashion, expanding to towns in the countryside and opening a branch in Boston. In 1997, at 54, I met Sebastian, a kind and good-humored widower who ran the delivery fleet for one of our fabric suppliers. We started as friends, sharing stories about our children and grandchildren, about the challenges of starting over after being alone for so long. Gradually, the friendship transformed into something deeper, a quiet companionship that caught me completely by surprise. I married him in a simple ceremony, with John as my best man. It was a new beginning that I had never imagined for myself, a second chance to experience a type of partnership that I had come to believe was not written in my destiny. With Sebastian, I got to know the America I had never had the opportunity to explore. We traveled together through the South. I saw the ocean for the first time at 57 years old, an experience that made me feel simultaneously tiny before the blue immensity and completely alive, as if every cell in my body awakened to a new dimension of existence. They were happy years of discovery and growth, not only personal, but also professional. Elaine Creations became Elaine and John, reflecting the true nature of the partnership we had built. More than a family business, it was the concrete symbol of our journey together, of the difficulties overcome and the victories won side by side. I officially retired at 67, although I continued to visit the atelier regularly, offering suggestions or simply observing with pride the empire we had built from nothing. Sarah, my eldest granddaughter, began to show a natural talent for fashion design, suggesting that the family legacy could continue for another generation. Sebastian passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void that will never be completely filled, but also precious memories that I carry with me every day. Since then, I divide my time between John and Mary's apartment and Sarah's, who is now expecting her first child, my first great-grandchild. And so, my dears, we come to the present. Looking back at the journey I've shared with you throughout these videos, I realize how each moment, even the most painful ones, was essential to weave the multicolored tapestry that is my life. That frightened 19-year-old girl, thrown out of her home for being pregnant without knowing who her child's father was, could never have imagined that one day she would be a successful businesswoman, a proud grandmother, a woman at peace with her past and eager for the future. I never discovered who John's biological father was. I never knew if it was Gregory with his safe and conventional love, or Isaac with his free spirit and dreaming nature. And in the end, it really didn't matter. What matters are the choices we make in the circumstances that life presents us. What matters is the courage to move forward, even when the path seems impossible. What matters is love. The love that sustains us, that challenges us, that transforms us. My story isn't extraordinary. It's just one among millions of stories of women who faced prejudice, overcame obstacles, and built meaningful lives from difficult circumstances. If it has touched you in some way, if it has brought comfort or inspiration, then it has fulfilled its purpose. I thank each of you who accompanied me on this journey. I'll continue answering your questions and sharing small stories here on the channel. Always remember, life comes full circle, paths cross in unexpected ways, and even the most painful mistakes can lead us to wonderful places we might never have found otherwise. With all my love, I say goodbye for today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary, and share with anyone who might benefit from this story. Until our next meeting, dear ones, Mrs. Elaine thanks each one of you.